Our 9:50 timed item is a Public Works item, and this is a presentation on draft State Route 89 and State Route 267 Corridor Strategic Implementation and Phasing Plan. All right, so we've got a PowerPoint presentation up, and I'm thinking that, we have our presenter in public in Tahoe, correct? Yes.
That's correct.
All right, good morning.
Good morning. And we're not seeing the presentation here, but we can kind of see it behind you all, so we'll do our best to work through it. But I'm Seth Warren. I'm with the Department of Public Works. Good morning, Madam Chair and the members of the board.
Before you keep going, I just want to make sure that we get the presentation up there.
It's appearing now. Thank you so much.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. Now, please continue. We're trying to do our best to make sure everybody can see everything.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. So once again, Madam Chair and members of the board, I'm Seth Warren with the Department of Public Works. And the action we're requesting today is for the board to receive a presentation on the State Route 89 and 267 corridor strategic implementation and phasing plan, and to provide direction prior to completion. I'm supported here by Derek Kirkland from our prime consultant, Wood Rogers, and online we have James Pangberg from Wood Rogers, as well as our sub-consultants in traffic and transit from Kittleson and HDR. So next slide, please. So as you can see here, we have a number of exciting things to talk about. So in the interest of the board's time, we'll just jump right in. Next slide, please. So the RTTP, Resort Triangle Transportation Plan, was a transportation plan that was adopted by the board in October of 2020. Focuses on a number of improvements along the corridors seen here. Along the west side, you see State Route 89, and on the east side, you see State Route 267. The RTTP included a number of key recommendations that work together and seek to reduce congestion during peak periods, optimize use of existing infrastructure, such as roadways and parking areas, and promote public transit use on SR 89 and 267. Now, just a reminder that SR 89 and 267 are two-lane highways built to rural design standards many years ago. The RTTP included a recommended roadway cross-section that addressed some of the deficiencies, and specifically, it sought to widen the existing roadways to add a center, reversible, transit-only lane. Next slide, please. You can see that recommendation here in this nice cross-section rendering. In the center, you see the reversible transit-only lane. It's grade separated with some curbs and a depression. Buses would run through that center lane, be reversible, as I mentioned, so we can speak to that a little bit more as we proceed through, but on either side would be our standard travel lanes for single passenger vehicles. In June 2023, Placer County initiated the Strategic Implementation and Phasing Plan, and it sought to be a deeper dive on the recommendations and alternatives that were presented in and recommended in the RTTP. It primarily focused on the feasibility analysis of the transit-only lanes, but it also includes a high-level study of traffic and transit operation impacts, evacuation capacity, along with various other construction, funding, and environmental considerations. The county formed a technical working group of stakeholder agencies that would be impacted by a transit project within these corridors. And we worked with this group throughout the development of the strategic plan. The study area on State Route 89 is from West River Street in Truckee down to Tahoe City. And on 267, it's from Schaefer Mill Road in the Truckee area to North Star Drive. In addition, Caltrans is working on a separate truck climbing extension lane south of North Star Drive of 267. With that, I'll hand it off to our consultant.
Thanks, Seth. Good morning. Derek Kirkland with Wood Rogers. I'm going to run through kind of the bulk of the feasibility plan. So next slide, please. So with this, we our team included Wood Rogers, HDR, Kittleson worked on traffic, HDR was transit, and a few other consultants on our team. Our goal was to really come in and look at what was done with RTTP and kind of build on that and elaborate on that the center bus lane concept. And so through this process, there were some questions that came up as to why wasn't bus on shoulder considered. There was a lot of discussion about that element. That's been used in California and other areas. It's been used in areas like Park City. And so the question just came up as to, is the center running lane, why was that chosen in RTTP? Going back a little bit with the working group, there was a lot of concerns from CHP, a lot of concerns from Caltrans, mainly because of the snow country and some of the things that we deal with here, that there was fears that taking away that shoulder would cause a lot of problems in emergency vehicle access, including during like an evacuation period. And so what we came up with was started asking ourselves kind of as a team is, what about buses on the outside? If the bus is on the outside, kind of what generated that was just the operation. Operations of a center running transit lane really limits you what you can do. And so we started looking at some of the outside bus only lane, and we said, okay, what if we can do it with a shoulder? And in areas where we get certain constraints, more so on 89, in some areas where it does get narrow, we asked Caltrans and CHP, what about, in constrained areas if we went to more of like an emergency pullout situation? And that was tested on SR28 with some success. And so I think at the end of the day, it was decided amongst the working group that yes, we should add back in an alternative 2 to look at, which was really this outside bus lane with shoulders concept. And so that's why you see in the feasibility that these were primarily the 2 alternatives that we looked at. And we looked at some variations of these alternatives, but it was basically, these were the kind of the top 2. Next slide, please. When we started analyzing this, one of the things, there was just a lot of pluses that came out of alternative 2. And so we started thinking, well, what does the footprint look like? How much bigger, if you get all these benefits with operations of having the outside bus lanes, the biggest one being from a transit operations perspective, with the center running lane, you have to have a management plan. Typically, it's limited to just the local jurisdiction buses. So in this case, TARP buses that know how to use it, because it's basically one direction. So you can't have other buses in there that don't know how the operations plan works. So with the outside transit lanes, they're more open. So basically the difference really came down to you can run 70 vehicles per hour on outside lanes versus 2 vehicles per hour generally with the center running lane. Obviously there's some variations of that, but it's just a much better operations plan. We can have a whole lot of different transit vehicles that can use that. When we're talking about getting people to getting people back and forth between the communities and ski resorts, having the flexibility to add different types of vehicles seemed like it was a huge plus in this case. And so then our engineering team started looking at, okay, well, what's the ramifications of that? What's the impacts of adding basically an extra lane compared to the 3 lane? What we found is as we were going through the Caltrans design standards, if we put the bus in the middle, we have to have overhead signage, at least at a minimum every time we introduce a new driveway, a new road that's coming on to 89 or 267. In the case of 89, we have a lot of driveways to deal with. So then there was questions about turn movements. Well, what about turn movements? If the bus is going down the middle of the road, how do we deal with driveways? And so the thought was that, especially on 89, there might be some areas where we actually have to not allow left-hand turns anymore. So that was a big concern. But primarily with the center running lane, we had to add overhead signage. Obviously, that lane actually gets wider because of the striping we have to add and some of the safety features to make sure people don't get into that lane while bus is coming head on. So between all that, the footprint actually was not that much difference. And I think you can see in this exhibit on the right, alternative 2 with that extra lane is really, there's not a whole lot of difference in the corridor improvements. When we started looking at the engineering design, in some of the cases, especially on 89, we're going to have to widen the roadway anyways to accommodate that 3rd lane. It's really, you're building a little bit taller of a wall. You're building, in some cases, we can go to limit our minimal shoulders. We can go down to like 4-foot shoulders. In some cases, we might be able to get away with some emergency pullouts in certain sections to avoid bigger impacts. So there's a lot of benefits in terms of design and constructability with the 4-lane option that also promotes a lot better flexibility in terms of operations and keeping Turn movements in the highway generally operating as similar as a 2-lane versus having the bus running down the center. Obviously, with the 4-lane, it's going to be a little bit higher capital cost, which we'll get into here in a minute. And obviously, it's an extra lane, so there's a little bit more maintenance costs. Next slide, please. So getting into the cost benefit analysis, so basically what we wanted to do was kind of compare, well, what are some factors? And so we worked with the working group to basically come up with a way to score these in terms of what are the benefit versus the cost. And so some of the evaluation categories, we looked at overall constructability, we looked at potential environmental impacts, we looked at right-of-way and utility impacts, we looked at the overall traffic, how it performs traffic, how it performs from a transit operations perspective. We looked at potential O&M costs, and we looked at kind of the overall safety concerns that it might have. We looked at agency support, working with the working group and kind of where the agencies landed, and then also basically from an infrastructure capital cost. I think you'll see there's a lot of similarities with 89 and 267. Generally, the benefits were pretty high in terms of the operations pieces. Constructability, whether we're building 3 lanes or 4 lanes, there's not a whole lot of difference there, especially on 267 where we have a lot of right-of-way, a lot of flat area, not a huge deal. And so you can see alternative 2 does have a little bit higher of a cost in terms of infrastructure capital. But I think the long-term benefits of having the flexibility of how those lanes can be used in the future far outweighs that additional cost. Next slide, please. And here's 89. So similar evaluation categories. You're going to see a little bit different scores. Obviously, the environmental impacts with 89, especially as we get south of Olympic Valley Road, becomes a little bit more challenging than 267 and kind of the north segment of 89, mainly because of now we're starting to get into the Tahoe Basin, so there's an extra TRPA environmental step we have to go through, a lot more steeper slopes, there's existing bridges, there's just a whole bunch of other things that we got to deal with that is going to make the environmental more complex for that section. We do have similar as 267 though, the transit performance, the traffic performance with the outside transit lanes, it functions way better, gives you way more flexibility going into the future. And I think overall from a safety perspective on 89, we saw alternative 2 score a lot higher, mainly because with all the driveways and roadways on 89 that are coming in, with the outside transit lanes, we can have those function normal. Kind of similar to as they do today versus the center where we may have to restrict some of those to right-ins, right-out only, which makes it a challenge in this corridor. So same thing, it is a slightly higher cost, and I think you'll see that cost get a little bit bigger difference on 89, mainly because that southern section is going to require some changes to bridges and things like that. But overall, we still feel that the additional cost, the benefits that you get are worth that extra cost. Next slide, please. So when we get into transit demand, part of what we wanted to analyze was what are the estimated ridership numbers? What does it look like? How does it help us? I think the biggest thing is with the efficiency. So basically, the outside transit lanes allow you to run 2-way transit any time of the day. Whereas the reversible transit lanes are pretty much limited to peak direction. And also because of that, you introduce this management plan with a center running transit, which basically Placer County TART would have to run, and it really would exclude a lot of transit vehicles from getting into that, so there's not confusion. I think the outside lanes also give us a chance to really improve on transit operations in terms of headways, and so it's more reliable in terms of buses going both ways any time of the day in those lanes. To improve our headways, which ultimately improving those headways is gonna increase our ridership numbers. All these estimates are based on data that was available in the Triangle Transportation Plan. Obviously, that data needs to be updated, and so that's part of the next steps, which Seth can get into a little bit later. Is is really looking at the data and kind of diving deeper to really understand the transit and kind of working with the TARP plan that's going on right now to really, understand what those transit estimates could be in the future. But right now we're just using what you see here is basically just old data from the RTTP. So we do anticipate that as this project moves forward, these will get updated and we'll have more realistic. But I think that the takeaway here is that the outside transit lanes gives us a whole lot more flexibility. It makes transit more reliable, and therefore we should be able to see in the future make it easier to gain more reliable headways. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, so 89-267, very similar in terms of basically what we're seeing is that we do anticipate with going to 30-minute headways that you would see a pretty strong increase in estimated ridership. But again, we're going to have to do some data collection and work with the planning efforts that TART's doing now and kind of flush some of that out. And some of this will evolve as this project moves forward. Next slide, please. Parking management, obviously, parking management's going on now. There's park and ride lots that are being used. And so those are the blue dots, I believe, are basically the, I think the orange dots, right? The orange dots are the ones that I believe are being used today. And so I think that the gist of the parking management is we kind of looked at what's available, what's out there, mainly looked at publicly available. A lot of schools have been used in the past for these types of efforts, especially on a interim basis. But as these transit lanes move forward, something that's going to be an ongoing conversation is parking management. I don't think there's any way for us to solve that today. A lot of factors are going to go into parking management going forward. Some of the stuff we've heard is, leave your car behind. If regional transit increases, and those are the types of buses that would be allowed to use those outside transit lanes. If we have more regional type buses that are bringing people up from Sacramento, the Bay Area, Reno, leave their cars behind, obviously they don't need a parking space when they get here. Some of the other things we heard was microtransit and how that's going to impact some of this. Microtransit vehicles could use those outside transit lanes as well. But obviously, if there's microtransit running around, that could spread some of the desire for parking out. That could have less of an impact on the need for parking. And so where we're at today is we've established that this conversation needs to continue. There are definitely some public lots out there that could be explored, but that basically a parking analysis would have to be done kind of as the project moves forward. And we have a better understanding of what a transit operations plan could look like, what transit operators are going to be using those, and how all that could impact parking. So again, I think it's an ongoing discussion. We don't have all the answers today, but there's definitely something to think about as the project moves forward. Next slide, please. The other thing we got into is we moved into implementation. Once we figured out it's made a lot of sense for the outside transit lanes, was project phasing and kind of looking at how that works. And I think it became more of a complex question more than anything. So really what you see is, and kind of mimics what was in RTTP, is basically these are more segments than phasing. Obviously you've got two different distinct segments on 89, kind of the north section of 89, north of Olympic Valley Road, and kind of the south section that goes into Tahoe. And then obviously 267 up to North Star. I think we're kind of the primary segments, and obviously Caltrans is working on some stuff in terms of climbing lanes, which would really serve as a climbing lane rather than a transit only lane once we start climbing up the summit there. And then obviously figuring out a section in Kingsbury, which would basically, or Kings Beach, which would basically be more tied to what happens with 28 and kind of the Tahoe Basin in the future. Next slide, please. And I think a lot of those phasing, there's a lot of things that'll play into how the phases come out. Funding availability, obviously there's this Caltrans process that we're going to have to go to, that we're going to be embarking on, and obviously Placer County staff and board, community, and different agency input all could factor into what phases actually move forward and when. A big determining factor is going to be this Caltrans process. And I think now that we've completed the alternatives and started looking at a plan forward with implementation, this next step of where we're going to be is the PID phase, or project initiation document phase, where we start to work with Caltrans through like a project study report. And so we'll be kind of moving into that. And that's where we'll start doing a whole bunch more data collection to start lining this up with different funding sources. But generally, we have to get through the PID phase to flush out kind of the project requirements, the level of environmental document that we're going to be going through. So a preliminary environmental analysis or repair will be done. And then that'll advise basically how we move into the PA&ED phase, which is the project approval and environmental documentation, where we get into more detailed 30% design. And then obviously, hopefully, start lining it up for funding for the different phases or segments, and then moving into final design and then ultimately construction. And obviously, as I mentioned, with this PID phase, we're also going to be looking at grant opportunities and a whole bunch of different things that come with that as well, including the fairly large data collection effort, mainly to line it up with grant funding, but also kind of inform that PA and ED phase. Next slide, please. Another thing we looked at in terms of implementation and looking at different segments or phasing was this project risk matrix that we put together. Largely what we did is we analyzed the 3 segments, and we came up with, is there a low risk, kind of a medium risk, something that we can deal with, or a high risk that could cause potential impacts to schedule or change the way we may have to implement certain things. And with that in mind, we excuse me, looked at funding, we looked at the overall transit benefit, we looked at constructability, environmental clearance potential, obviously TRPA involvement, mainly when we get towards that basin area. And then we looked at permitting, right-of-way, potential for public opposition. We looked at coordination with adjacent projects that are ongoing, and we also looked at just kind of the overall evacuation. We didn't do like a real big evacuation analysis with this. That's something I think that will probably be done as the project moves forward, but we did look at the potential benefits and risk of that. And so what we found was, obviously with 267, pretty low risk, a lot of Caltrans right-of-way out there, minimal slopes, and so to get that footprint put in would be a pretty low risk, and would generally move through the process relatively quickly. 89, the north section of 89, West River to Olympic Valley, starts to get into a little more complexity. There's a decent amount of right-of-way, but there's steep slopes, there's existing walls out there that we may have to touch. Obviously, we've got the Truckee River on one side, and so there's definitely some more constrained areas. Generally, I think there are things that we can work through, and I think the biggest one that was coming up in the working group that will probably need to be evaluated at some point as we move through the PID is the mouse hole. Obviously, our feasibility study stopped at West River for now, but there's a lot of discussion about how the mouse hole could play into this, and so that's something that'll have to continue to be explored, either as a separate project or if it ends up being part of this project segment. Obviously, we'd add a potential for a substantial increase in funding for the segment, time constraints dealing with UP and everything that comes through there. So it's just something that'll have to be evaluated. And then obviously once we get to segment 3, it gets a little more challenging. We have a lot more environmental stuff we have to get through. Now we're touching bridges and existing walls, the Truckee River, steep slopes. There's just a lot more that we're going to have to deal with on that segment to get this segment through there, existing trails. And so that's just something where, as we get through the PID phase, we'll kind of flush out this risk matrix a little bit more and dive deeper into some of these things. Next slide, please. So looking at an implementation schedule, so we basically used kind of the Caltrans process, thought about some of the risks, and basically laid out what we feel would be somewhat of a realistic schedule. Obviously, things change as we move through the PID process, and this will continue to get updated. But the general thought on schedule is that you would do the PID phase for all 3 segments at the same time to flush those projects out and get them ready for PA and ED. And then you would generally start PA and ED pending funding on one or all of the segments. And then in the perfect world, if the schedule lays out if you started them all at the same time. This is kind of shows you generally that you can see the constraints in segment 3 are going to push your construction out a whole lot farther because it's going to take us longer for each phase to get through versus a segment 1, 267, which you could get through some of the PA&E a lot quicker. So it just kind of gives you an idea, mainly from a perfect world, if everything started and how it could lay out. But again, this is all going to be dependent on funding, community priority, and so segment 2 could move forward before segment 1 and segment 3, and that's just generally the time frame that we anticipate that it would take, just given the constraints. Next slide, please. Funding is definitely going to be for projects of this size, especially when we look at the 89 section. It's typically a package of funding. So we laid out just some general, and obviously this is already probably outdated, but we laid out kind of a general federal, state, and local, just some sources that could be used. And it's probably not one of each. It's probably going to be multiple funding sources that make this up. One of the nice things about this project that we feel could set this up for future success is that it has a lot of project elements. It has the potential for obviously transit improvements, which is a big one, environmental improvements that come along with that. There's a lot of safety improvements we could add to the project. And obviously with the 4-lane versus the 3-lane, there's a huge benefit in terms of future evacuation that we'll have to evaluate further, but just generally adding another lane adds benefit for that. And so some of these things could tie to multiple funding sources that we could be chasing through the PID phase. And so through the PID phase, we're going to be evaluating some of these in more detail. I think what's important now is that it is going to take a lot of local funding to leverage some of the state and federal funding. And I think Placer County has some really good opportunities there with some of the local funding sources available. And so I think we'll continue to evolve. This funding table will continue to evolve, especially through the PID phase and especially as all these funding opportunities change over the next few years. So we'll continue to monitor that, but we kind of set this up so we can kind of easily change and add things and kind of monitor what funding opportunities exist for this project. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude my presentation and hand it back over to Seth, and we're here to answer any specific questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Next slide, please. Just a few more. So next steps. The design team has addressed the final comments from the working group and taken the strategic plan as far as we can take it, and that was completed in early 2025. DPW staff and our consultant team have presented the strategic plan to board of directors groups for local business associations, MACs, and transportation committees. That started just about the time I started, about, I guess, October through May. Or sorry, yeah, we have one in late April. So we're continuing to present this to anyone who likes to hear about it. Then next, we will be preparing the Caltrans PID document, as Derek mentioned, and we will be performing additional data collection that will be key to unlocking critical grant funding for the project. We anticipate the traffic data collection will be performed in the 2025-2026 peak season. So next slide. As a reminder, the action being requested of the board today was to receive this presentation on the strategic plan and provide direction prior to plan completion. And with that, we're here to answer any questions and respond to any comments you might have.
Great. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Appreciate that presentation. I don't see current question. Oh, Supervisor Gustafson, go ahead with your questions, please.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the presentation, and I've seen this several times, and I appreciate the thoroughness and all the work that's gone into looking at this project over many years, because we've been talking about this since Bus on Shoulder discussions, gosh, I want to say 15, 20 years ago. But I had a couple specific questions. One is, at the intersection of 267 Schaefer Mill Road and Truckee Tahoe Airport Road, there's been a longstanding desire from our residents in that area of Martis Valley to see a roundabout at that intersection. Was that taken into account as you looked at the bus lane discussion?
Can you speak to that?
This is Derek Kirkland, Wood Rogers. I believe that came up during the working group And I believe we did have some conversation with HDR around that. I think the level that we're at right now, it was determined that, you know, we're not going to look specifically at how a different type of intersection would function. But I think as we move into the PID phase, that's definitely something that we're going to get into, is looking at specific, you know, is this going to be a roundabout? Is this going to be a signalized intersection? Because that will have an impact through that PID phase. And PA&ED is, you know, obviously do we need to expand the footprint of that intersection? And then how does the bus function on an outside lane as it enters a roundabout versus a signalized intersection? So while we didn't get into a lot of that detail with this study, it is something that is going to get flushed out as this process moves forward.
Great. I know that there's been a real interest in getting a roundabout at that location for the subdivisions, as well as for the airport district, the industrial park there, and a lot of the interactions that go on at that intersection. There's quite extensive delays at times. Second question on the 89 section, the county has been pursuing for, I want to say 25, maybe 30 years, a bike trail connection from Olympic Valley Road up to the town of Truckee. We've done more recent studies on that. But how do you see that interplaying with a widened road? I mean, is there an opportunity, I guess, putting on Supervisor DeMattei's hat, trying to be creative about how we save taxpayer money? And is there a mechanism by which you've considered that additional pavement that would be used for transit, primarily in the peak winter months, being somewhat available, or the shoulders more available for an improved trail along there versus creating a whole separate trail project? I know that's not ideal. I've built a lot of trails in my career, but it would be significantly less expensive and more thoughtful on taxpayer money. So I'm just wondering if that is an option to consider.
Yeah, I would say that, so currently the alignment for the trail between town of Truckee and the first northerlymost campground is on the east side of the river, so that wouldn't be impacted by the project. But to the south of that, it's very preliminary alignments, and some of the looking at is kind of pushing that bike trail closer to the road against the slope west of SR 89. So definitely there are opportunities to kind of combine that pavement and not have a fully separated, you know, class 1 facility, if that makes sense.
Well, it would be great to really consider that. I know that some of those alignments included underpasses under the highway and very expensive alternatives to get a bike trail accomplished. And I just returned from a trip where I saw so many different unique types of infrastructure and transportation infrastructure in Europe, and seeing colorized pavement and other types of barriers to ensure safety of trail users, but also provide the most environmentally sensitive alternatives, I think is worth looking at in this corridor, because it truly is a very unique corridor with the river and the mountains there. And I would hope as we move into the next phase, we'd consider where we could combine those projects and have a real win-win on funding. Overall, I want to commend you. I think our community really is interested in moving and continuing to expand transit and transit operations, but until we can get the buses to the destinations people want to get to in a more expedited fashion, it doesn't make sense to get out of your SUV and move all of your things into a bus, and yet so many other destinations do that very successfully. But we have to expedite the transit traffic. And of course, the concerns about any sort of an emergency, we talk a lot about catastrophic wildfire right now, but I've lived there enough years that I've seen landslides, mudslides, avalanches cross the road and create barriers to ingress and egress to the basin. So there's many opportunities when you have a wider road to be able to address that and make sure that we can get our public safety officials in and the equipment in that is necessary and get people out. And so I really commend your efforts on this, and am excited to see it move forward to the next phase and see if we can drive that excitement that's going to be necessary to get federal and state funding to help us, because clearly this is not something the county can do on its own.
Thank you. Let's see, no other questions right now from my colleagues. We'll go ahead and open up this item for public comment. I don't see anyone here in Auburn, but I'm pretty sure we've got some folks up in North Lake Tahoe. So if y'all want to come on up and provide comments, happy to hear them. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Sarah Lawis again. And as Cindy said, any of us that live here locally know the importance of trying to deal with this issue. And as is pointed out, it's mostly these peak times that we run into all these traffic problems. And one thing that I have not seen in any of the presentations I go to, and is listed on your mention of funding, federal, state, local, and then it says local question mark. Don't understand why Vail Associates and Altera aren't included in this funding almost as a mandate, since so much of the quote unquote peak traffic problems are around the resorts, those resorts in particular in ski season. That was standing, of course, not talking about evacuation importance and other things, but peak time, peak traffic, so often, as all of us that live here know, is around the resorts. So I would personally and locally like to see that those Vail Associates and Altera, the mountains that bring so much of the traffic and profit from it, aren't also required in some form to put the funding towards this project. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Ann Nichols, North Tahoe Preservation Alliance. I'd love to hear a discussion about how expanding these 2 lanes on like 267 or 89, when they go down to, again, 2 lanes, how that's not just going to cause a parking lot there, because the infrastructure at the lake on 28 is 2 lanes. And 4 lanes to 2 lanes just means people will be stopped. And then the contraflow thing during evacuation, that doesn't work very well unless you have people on every single intersection. So I'd love to hear a discussion of that. And certainly this is all, you know, we can't even get to the hospital in Truckee during certain times because of the ski areas overselling passes. So unless they have to be part of this discussion, they have to limit the amount of skiers on site so that we have some cap, some baseline. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rob Olson, Alpine Meadows. Yeah, I mean, I've seen the traffic. I do think it's getting better with the reserved parking spaces. I'm encouraged to keep exploring this more. I like the ideas that Cindy brought up about how else can we use these lanes maybe in the summertime. I really want people to come to Tahoe and say they're doing right things here and they're being smart about stuff. We need to, it's such a beautiful place. We need to be a place where people come and say they're doing a lot of great things. I mean, we can't solve all the world's problems, but we can try to alleviate a lot of these stresses that we have and the complexity. I do represent the property owners at Big Chief Lodge, which yes, we are going to try to get going, and that's not an April Fool's joke. But we did add a center turn lane, and I hope that stuff like that would stay there because that's vital to the business to get in and out of that property. So keep pushing forward on it, and let's hear some good thoughts on it. And we do want that bike path. We do need alternate transportation and getting people out of cars. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else there in North Lake Tahoe? All right, we'll move to Zoom. If anyone's got a comment on Zoom, please.
Caller, go ahead and unmute your mic and give your comments.
Good morning, Madam Chair, distinctive board members. My name is Tony Kowalski. I'm President and CEO of the North Tahoe Community Alliance. Sorry I couldn't be in Kings Beach today. This April Fool's joke was a little silly to be able to move around easily, but thank you so much for providing public access through our technological channels. I just wanted to touch on a few things around this project. Number one, thank you to the board and staff for really helping support the future of transit opportunities and growing them in our region. Number one, on top of that, I'd like to point out that funding for this study came through our review process in our TOT TBID Dollars at Work program, and it was TOT dollars that helped fund this through review of our Capital Advisory Projects Committee and also our Board of Directors here at the NTCA. Both of those bodies unanimously supported moving this project forward. They see the potential for this project to really bring meaningful change to our area, and as Supervisor Gustafson said, really prioritizing the bus circulation within the destination to further move people out of their vehicles and into a more convenient and routine transit method, further reducing congestion in the region. I also want to point out just one thing, that this is really part of a larger partnership around transit in the region. It's not just the public dollars that go to this that are super important, but it's also a lot of the private efforts, some of which have been mentioned so far, like the parking management programs that the resorts have rolled out, not just with reservations, but with private-public partnerships through our Park and Ride programs. Our Highway 89 corridor park and ride program this year has been incredibly successful in reducing congestion in partnership with the parking reservations at Palisades Tahoe, for instance. They've routinely done over 5,000 rides on the park and ride each weekend day throughout the season. So it's been incredibly successful. My point here is that there are a lot of different levers we need to pull around public transit, and it's going to take public and private partnership to be there, and the support of county staff and, of course, the Board of Supervisors to get us ultimately to a destination, as Rob pointed out, where we can be proud and people can come in and say, wow, they're doing something right in Tahoe. And we can become that example that Cindy cited in Europe maybe one day, where people come to us and visit us for the reason that it's so easy to get around. Thank you very much for your support.
Thank you. Anyone else online?
I see no further commenters.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate the comments. I'll bring this back to the board for any further conversation or direction. Supervisor DiMattei.
Thank you guys for the presentation. I've always been a fan of alternate number 2 since it came to the Planning Commission. It just seems to make more sense, especially if you're not going to get all your ducks in a row until 2026. 4 lanes might even be turned into 5 lanes. Along with what Supervisor Gutherson says, adding a trail or anything along the riverside at this time would probably be the cheapest way to go. I totally agree with something like that, and it could move pedestrians or it could move bikes along the riverside, not up the mountainside. Somebody commented they would like to see the ski resorts put money into this. I believe Alturas is actually on their own donating $2 million to TARP to help fund some of their transportation. I thought I heard in their presentation a year ago. Maybe a suggestion on heavy ski days, it is hard to get through places. If we were able to hire CHP or even our own Placer County Sheriffs on overtime to help direct traffic on those days that we know they're going to be heavy ski days, kind of like an event, a basketball game or something happening downtown where we have that, might be something to look into as well that would help traffic. That's all I have.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Supervisor Gustafson.
I would agree on alternative 2 and proceeding in that direction. And I've already mentioned my other thoughts, that we try to build into this the flexibility on both the trail and the potential roundabout. Going to, excuse me, to some of the public comments on limiting access into the Tahoe Basin, I definitely support ideas and concepts on that. It's just, it's not within our authority as either the county or as TRPA, we have to rely on the states of California and Nevada on any type of monitoring or metering of visitation. And it's a very challenging discussion to have because billions of dollars of state and federal funding have gone in to protect Lake Tahoe. So how do we best deal with growing numbers of population that are seeking the lake environment in the peak heat times of the summer and the growing population in Western Nevada coming up to visit? How do we do that effectively? And we've always been in the situation of trying to manage our tourism. And if we just let it go unchecked, it will be a disaster. And so here's a step moving forward to try to manage it and make the situation better. Hopefully, some of those other efforts and ideas like basin entry fees and things like that could be part of the solution that help fund this. But we have to have a project that we show we've thought through and we need the funding for in order to get the support of our states to even consider those sorts of alternatives. But I hear that concern from my neighbors, from my colleagues in the Tahoe area, and it is challenging, and we do need to face it head on and try to find solutions that better manage it. So thank you.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the report and the just really good job of detailing the pros and cons of each. And it does make sense to have 2 lanes and not just one dedicated lane. Just looking at the data, it's very clear for emergency access, just for ease, for having opportunity for more than just TART buses to utilize the additional lane. It really makes a lot of sense and gives a lot more flexibility. So really appreciate that alternative, and I don't think I hear anybody else saying we want the other alternative. So it looks like you can have some direction there. Any other comments? And we don't need to take a vote on this, do we? It's just direction.
Just one other comment. There was
Yes.
one, I think she was in person there, that she talked about the bottleneck. It's always going to be a problem. I mean, you're not going to build 4 lanes around the lake. So whether you're in the middle of the desert or you're in the mountains, you're always going to have that problem, and you're just going to have to navigate through it, unfortunately. So just want to make sure that you know that we're listening to you. So
Yeah, and this is a long-term project, right? And we'll be able to do one phase first and hooray, but it's not gonna end the challenges. But if we don't do anything and we don't start someplace, we'll never get anywhere. And so there are those challenges. Even if we build it, there's gonna be construction challenges, right? And people will be not happy about that. But at the end of the day, we've got to make progress, and I really appreciate the hard work staff has done to move the project forward and bring us to this point. So,
And I did want to speak to one other issue about the ski areas. They absolutely should be part of the funding solution, and through the TOT and TBID and maybe all other situations, they will be helping fund this. I am certain of that, and we will be moving forward in that direction. But we have a long way to go until we actually have our hands out asking for money.
right.
So.
All right, well, thank you very much for the presentation and the discussion and the feedback from the folks in Tahoe.